Earth is a competitive card game in which players try to amass the highest point total by the end of the game. As an example, each player has the ability to place up to 16 cards onto their island in a 4x4 grid. Once a player places their last card into their island, their 16th card, it will trigger the end of the game, and each player may have the possibility of having one extra turn. So what exactly goes onto your island? There's two different things that you can place onto your island. The first is going to be these green flora cards. As an example, we have the field bindweed. This card right here represents something that can grow on your island. So flora is going to be defined as plant life or fungus that is growing on your island. In addition to that, you can also have what's called terrain. So as an example, we have the prairie, and you can place the prairie onto your island, and it can give you specialized conditions over the course of the game or specialized victory point conditions toward the end of the game. Once the game ends, then you're going to go ahead and count up all the different point totals. So the first thing I'm going to do is walk you through all the different ways that you can score in this game. Each player is going to be given a player board at the beginning of the game, which corresponds to one of the 5 colors. When you start your island, you're going to have an island card, and you're going to notice in the top left-hand corner, and it's just above my thumb, there's a 6 next to a leaf icon. That is going to be the symbol in this game for victory points. So as an example, when we hit the end of the game, this card, so your basic island card, is going to score you 6 victory points. Next, we're going to look at the climate card, and each player is going to start with a climate card as well. And as an example, this one's going to net you 3 victory points at the end of the game. In addition to that, you have an event space on your board, and oftentimes the events are going to net you a negative victory point total over the course of the game. As an example, this one's going to take 2 points away from you if you played it over the course of the game. Next up, we're going to look at your tableau in your island, and the tableau is going to be defined as all of the cards in your 4x4 grid. Pretty much every single one of these cards is then going to have a victory point total actually listed on it. So as an example, this card is going to net you 7 points over the course of the game. So the primary way that you can score points is by simply placing cards down onto the table, and at the end of the game, you're going to go ahead and add those up. Next, we're going to move back over to the player board, and on the right-hand side toward the bottom is going to be your compost pile. I'm going to remove it so you can see the symbol. There is a leaf icon with arrows going around the edge of it. This means your compost pile. And as an example, over the course of the game, you're going to be placing cards into your compost pile. Each one of these cards at the end of the game is going to net you 1 victory point. So as you can see, this player has amassed quite a high number of cards in their compost pile. Next, we have these green sprout tokens, and these are going to be green little cubes. Each one of these cubes is going to net you 1 victory point at the end of the game. How do these cubes actually work? On each of the flora cards, or most of the flora cards, there are going to be these slots open. So as an example, right above my thumb, you can see that there are 6 spots for these cubes. So as you start playing the game, you're going to be placing these cubes on these slots. Each of these cards can never have more cubes on it than the open number of slots actually on it. In addition to that, if you don't have any open positions on your cards for sprouts, you can't actually take any sprouts. Thus, you can't kind of stash them off to the side on your board. They can only go into open locations on your cards. So at the end of the game, you're going to be counting up all of the different sprouts on all of your different flora, and thus you'll get 1 point per sprout. Another way to score victory points at the end of the game is trunks and canopies. These tan wooden pieces are going to be the trunks, and then these multicolored caps are going to be the canopies. Notice that the canopies come in multiple different colors. I think there's 4 total in the game. The color of the canopy is irrelevant. You can place any color type on top, and it doesn't actually impact the game. So for each one of these trunks, you're going to score 1 victory point unless you have a cap on the trunk. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through what that means. As an example, my thumb is pointing to the number 3 sort of on the right-hand side of this card. This is a Flora card. And what this means is that I can place up to 3 trunks onto this card. And what that means is that I'm going to be placing 2 trunks onto the card, so 2 of these wooden tokens, and then the third one is actually going to be the canopy. So conceptually what I'm going to be doing, and this might be kind of hard to see, but I'm going to go ahead and place the bindweed onto the table, and thus I can place 1 trunk onto the card, I can place a second trunk onto the card, and then since this has a 3 on here, the highest it can be is 3. So once I hit the third trunk on it, it's actually a canopy. So this is a little bit of a strange concept. This is probably one of the stumbling points that a lot of the new players find when they play the game. So as an example, if I just had 3 trunks on this card, I would score 3 victory points at the end of the game. But that's not the case for this card. If I am able to cap this out, and the autofocus needs to come back in, hopefully it will. So notice that there's a 5 on the right-hand side. If I have a fully capped growth, so these 3 tokens, it's going to net me 5 victory points instead of 1 victory point per trunk. So you're going to get a bonus if you add the canopy to a lot of your different sort of stems that you're growing over the course of the game. So be very mindful when you're playing that you can get bonus victory points by adding the canopy to any of your trunks that you are growing. As I mentioned before, terrain cards will help you at the end of the game score additional victory points. As an example, this is going to give you 10 points, but there's an extra condition toward the bottom of this card, and this is going to actually give you additional victory points toward the end of the game. And this says that you can get 5 victory points per this type of plant diagonally adjacent to this terrain. So when you're putting your island together, you're going to be mindful to find cards with this symbol on it, and if you build your island correctly, thus we place this card diagonally adjacent to it, this card is going to then net you an additional 5 victory points at the end of the game. Be very mindful of terrain. It can be highly impactful. When we were playing this game and teaching a lot of the new players, there were several players that really favored these terrain cards, and it was shocking to see at the end of the game how many additional victory points they were netting by simply putting these into play early on in the game and then building their island sort of around these types of terrain. We are now back to our player board, and I'm pointing to the right-hand side of the player board. This is going to be an ecosystem card that you're going to select at the beginning of the game. Ecosystems don't really do anything over the course of the game, but at the very end of the game, they help you score additional victory points. So this one is going to be 2 victory points per every yellow ability, and sort of this rainbow icon will count for that as well. So once we've done a lot of the scoring, there's actually going to be 3 ecosystem cards that you can score at the end of the game. Each player is going to have 1 ecosystem card on the right-hand side of their board, but there's also a set of ecosystem cards. I'm going to point to them. They're going to be right here and here on this sort of generic play area that you can score additional victory points on. And what's kind of fun about this is any of the players can score victory points off of anything on this board. So kind of what does that mean? Well, first up, we have 2 different ecosystems. So when we hit the scoring part at the end of the game, you can score points from the ecosystem on your island, and you can score points from these 2 ecosystems in the center of the board. Right as the game begins, and I always tell this to players, take some time to just look at what these ecosystems actually say. Kind of what we do at our game table, I just take these and we pass them around the table so everybody can get a chance to read them. Finally, I'm going to talk with you about how you can score points with the fauna cards on the game board. So fauna are going to be your animals that live on your island. So as an example, we're going to have 4 of these objectives on the island, and at the beginning of the game, we do have these leaf tokens, and these are going to be present on your player board in this location here. Notice that there's 4 of these set out right here. You can take these, and these tokens are going to be used on the fauna board, and notice that there are 4 fauna located on this generic playboard. Any player can score points by meeting whatever objective is actually on this card, and then they take their corresponding leaf token and place it on the open position at the top. So as an example, multiple players can score victory points over the course of the game, but it's going to be dependent upon how early they reach their objective. So this is going to be a nice, fun, competitive way that you can race the other players to get these points. As an example, if the green player is the first person to score with the green iguana, you might have another player that hits that objective later on in the game, and it's thus going to score them a slightly lower amount of points. So as you can see, if you're the first person to do it, you get more points, and then it goes down, down, and down. So be very mindful of these objectives over here. This is where the game is most competitive when it comes to you building your island and keeping track of stuff that's kind of going on in the middle of the game. Finally, there are some additional points that you can score, and I'm going to go ahead and point to it right here. And notice that there is a leaf icon here, and there is a 7 next to it. That means that you can score 7 victory points if you are the first person to finish building your island. So as we mentioned before, I'm going to try to zoom in on this. You can see that this right here, this icon, is a 4x4 grid. And that just simply means that when you have fully built your island, thus you've placed a total of 16 cards onto your island, as we showed in a previous clip, you're going to go ahead and take your player marker and place it right here onto the board, and that will net you an additional 7 victory points at the end of the game. Next, we're going to dive into how to pay for stuff in Earth. What I'm holding right here are soil tokens, and they're going to be placed kind of in the bottom part of your player board. When you play cards in this game, it's going to be keying off of soil. So as an example, I'm going to go ahead and just pull a card from the draw pile, and then I'm going to look in the upper left-hand corner of the card. If you notice, you see the soil icon. In addition to that, there's a number above it. So in this case, it's going to cost you 1 soil to put this card into play. So soil is going to be predominantly your basic resource for getting cards into play on your island. The next thing that we're going to talk about is how much soil you actually start the game with. So this is our island card, and my thumb is pointing to the bottom left-hand corner of this card, and there is a black section of this card. That black section means that it is triggered only one time when that card initially comes into play. So as you're doing the setup of the game, you're going to be putting your basic soil onto your board based upon your island card, and it's going to be dependent upon your island, and different islands have different amounts of soil on them. So as an example, and I'll try to zoom in as much as I can on this, notice that there are 4 soil tokens listed on this card. That means that on your initial island, you're going to have 4 soil that you can use to start the game. The next thing that we're going to do is I'm also going to kind of cover up the soil. And now I'm going to zoom in on this icon, and it looks like a hand grabbing cards. And then next to it is a symbol that has a hand in it, and then there's a circle around it with arrows. That's going to be your composting icon. So in the next clip, I'm going to walk you through kind of how to finish the setup and get the game going. On the bottom right-hand portion of the card, this is going to be your compost pile. So I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in on this icon. And if you can see, you still have that same sort of symbol on here, except there's a leaf in here. So this is going to be your personal compost pile. And what's going to happen is that you can compost cards from the draw deck, or you can compost cards from your hand. So in the last clip, kind of what we were looking at is when we're setting up the game, each island is going to have a different number of cards that we're going to draw. And in this case, there's a symbol with a hand, and that's compost from your hand. So what we're going to do when we're setting up the game is we're going to draw 5 cards from the draw deck, and then we're going to go ahead and take a look at them. So I'm just going to draw 5 of these cards from the top of the draw deck. Next up on your island card, it's going to say that you're going to compost one of them from your hand. And that just means that of the 5 that you draw, you're going to take one of them and then put them into your personal compost pile, which is going to be face down on the bottom right-hand corner of your player board. So kind of what does that mean? Well, what's happening here is that we're building up the compost pile, which for some cards can actually be used as a resource. So over the course of the game, you can take cards from this compost pile, put them in the discard pile, and as a result, it can trigger different effects or abilities. Now, what we learned earlier is that each one of these cards in your personal compost pile is going to score you 1 point at the end of the game. So think of it as, hey, I can use this as almost like a resource, but it's also a pool of points for us at the end of the game, so for victory points. If I spend it here, I get some sort of benefit, but then I'm going to lose a victory point at the end of the game. That's what makes this game so much fun. Earth is fun because you're constantly spending different resources over the course of the game to get different advantages. Sometimes those are short-term advantages, and sometimes those are long-term advantages. Next up, we're going to talk about the first player token or marker. There's a double-sided token that is part of the game. And when you start playing the game, simply put it down next to the player board of the person that makes the first turn in that game. Once the end condition is triggered, which is that there are 16 cards on someone's island, each person has one additional turn to go up until the first player. So as an example, if let's say the second player, let's say you're playing a 4-player game, the first player, it comes around, they put their 16th card into play, and then they pass the turn. Since the first player got to take a full turn, every other player that is in the game gets the same number of turns. So this is a way to sort of equalize and make sure that everybody gets the same number of turns before the game ends. So thus it would rotate all the way around the table, and each person will get the same number of turns. So once this token is placed, it does not move over the course of the game. Now, something else that we're going to talk about, this is going to be the active player token, and this is going to be double-sided as well. So I'm going to walk you through how this works, and this is going to be the core of what you do on every single turn. At the top of each person's player board are 4 different colored sections, and this is going to denote what the active action is for a given game round. The person that's playing this game, if you are the active player, you are given this token. And like I said before, this thing is double-sided. The active player will select one of the 4 locations to place this token on. And dependent upon where it's placed, that determines what things can be done over the course of that turn. Now, what makes Earth extremely unique and extremely fun and engaging, I believe, is this aspect. Note that once the active player puts this token down, every single other player gets to do something on that turn. It's not just the active player. That's what makes this game fun and exciting and keeps people engaged. They're constantly doing something. They're constantly adding to their island or playing different mechanics or whatnot. That's what makes it so exciting. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of these different actions, and once you have an understanding of that, there really isn't much more to learn about the game. It's pretty fluid, it's pretty easy to get into, and it's definitely easy to play. In this example, we're going to go over planting. Notice that the active player token is at the top of the board, so we know that we're going to be doing this action. If you are the active player, you're going to go ahead and execute everything on the top of this, and you can execute any sort of action that's dark green. If you are not the active player, you can take your leaf token and put it down below. And this means that you can trigger down below, and you can also trigger any of the green actions on your cards. So just note that it doesn't matter who or which player is active. Everybody gets to trigger all of their green events over the course of this turn, and I'll kind of walk you through a little bit what that means later. So if you're the active player, and I'm going to point to this icon, notice that it looks like a card going into play and it says +2. What that means is that you can take cards from your hand. So as an example, when we started the game, we were allowed to draw 5 cards, and then I put 1 in my personal compost, which allows me to have all of these cards. So if I kind of look at the top of this, I have one that's 2 soil, 4 soil, 6 soil, and 2 more soil. Now, when we did set up the game, we only have 4 to play. So what that means is that I can't physically play this 6 soil card because I simply don't have enough resources for it. But what I can do is I can play up to 2 different cards from my hand as long as I don't run out of soil. So what does that look like? I could potentially play this card for 4 soil. And then what I would do is I would simply go to my soil section on my playboard. I'd simply remove this from the supply, or to the supply rather, and then I would put this card into play, and this is going to be the basic beginning portion of my island. Once I have a card in play, I can play in basically any direction around this card, but it just simply has to be adjacent. With the whole point of this being that I'm going to have a 4x4 island, so you can kind of, see that this thing, it doesn't really shift. But maybe this is the top of your island, maybe it's the bottom of your island, maybe it's the exact center, right or left. You don't know really where that's going to be until you start building out your island. That's actually pretty cool, and it's a very fun mechanic in Earth as well, is that you start building around sort of your focal point and the initial card that you put into play. As another example, the icon at the top of the board here indicates that I can put a maximum of 2 cards into play. So instead of me placing this 4 cost soil card into play, I could alternatively spend all of my 4 soil, because each one of these 2 cost 2 a piece, so I could potentially put both of these into play on that turn as well. So I could put one down, and then when I put my second one down, like I said before, it can go in any sort of direction, but it has to be adjacent to that card. Why does it matter though, kind of the position? It depends on what cards you're putting into play. So some of these cards, as an example, this pasture, if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, it says that we're going to score 3 victory points per this type of plant that's orthogonally adjacent to this terrain. So orthogonally adjacent is going to be like a cross. It's going to be up and down and right and left. And if it says adjacent diagonally, that's going to be, stuff that's like here, 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 or here. So orthogonally and diagonally does matter in this game. So literally from the beginning of the game, we can see that positioning of these cards is very, very important. As an example, maybe I want to put the pasture down first, and then secondarily, this is one of those plants that's listed on the card that can score me extra victory points. So then I might put it down below that's orthogonally adjacent. Then that's going to score me some extra points at the end of the game. Next, we're going to talk about the icon that is just to the right of this. So we've already talked about how to play cards and put them into play. Next, we have this symbol, and what you're seeing is that you're supposed to draw 4 cards from the draw deck, and the slash means that you get to keep one of those. So as an example, we're going to take 4 cards from the draw deck. I'm going to go ahead and flip those over. I can look at them, but then I can only keep one of these cards, and then the other one. So as an example, I might want to keep this card because it has that fun symbol that triggers off my pasture. So that might be something that I keep. This is then going to go into my hand. Now these other 3 cards, and this is where I see some confusion, these are discarded, which means that they go to the side of an actual discard pile. So I'm going to go ahead and just, pan over. Here's a draw deck. These cards are going to go into the discard pile. One of the things that I see a lot of players do, especially new ones that are playing this game, when they see this icon, they take these cards and then they throw them into their personal compost pile, which is over here, and that's wrong. You don't want to be doing that. This symbol at the top of the board means that they go to the discard pile as opposed to your personal compost. Now we're going to have a quick conversation about this icon in the middle. If you look at it, it is a dark green color surrounded by a white border. And what that means is that some of the cards that end up in play might have a triggered event. So when you see this, it means that you can trigger those events. So as an example, our island card, which is Iceland, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. Notice that it actually has a triggered event that corresponds to this color. Any single time you do this action, whether you're the active player or you're not the active player and you're a secondary player, you get to trigger all of those different things in your tableau, which is going to be your 16 cards, maximum of 16 cards that you're building on your island. And it also includes your island and your climate. Those can also trigger as well. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and zoom in, and we can take a look at what's happening. So once I have a triggered event, it says that I'm going to add +2 soil. So those are going to be my basic resources that we talked about before. And we're going to get 2 per red card that you planted in this turn. So kind of what does that mean? Well, a lot of the cards in the game, they have these borders at the bottom, and these are going to be your triggered event colors. So as an example, this one has an orange triggered event, which is going to correspond to this category. So if I were to play this into play on this turn, it's then going to net me 2 additional soil. So then I would take 2 soil from the bank and I'd put it onto my player card. What makes this game fun is that, like I said before, even if it's not your turn, you can be doing different actions and thus even triggering events. Next, what I'm going to talk about is the bottom part of the card, and we're going to talk about what happens if you're not the active player. What's going on? Well, the other player, the active player, is performing actions for their island. At the start of a player turn, whoever the active player is takes the icon marker and they're going to place it at the top of their playboard. In this example, we are going to assume we are not the active player, but rather one of the secondary players at the table. In this example, the active player has selected the planting action, which is this green one. So what I'm going to do is take my leaf token and I'm going to place it at the bottom of the card. What that means is that while the active player is doing their active portion, which is at the top of this, it means that all other players at the table can be doing the bottom portion of this. So as an example, while the active player is planting their 2 cards, this gives me the opportunity to plant a maximum of 1 card per turn. In addition to that, I can take 1 card from the draw pile and I can place that directly into my hand. So now this is what gets really exciting and really fun. Everybody at the same time, and this gets a little bit chaotic the first couple times you play this. Once you learn the game, everybody's going to be playing and building on their island all at the same time. And the reason why this can get a little bit chaotic, if the other players don't understand the rules perfectly, they might be doing something a little bit wrong. They might be adding more resources or not adding enough resources, or other things can be happening. So the first couple times you play this game, make sure that you do this in sort of a controlled effort and you just go around the table. And if you're teaching the game to people, make sure they understand exactly what all the icons mean. About halfway through the game, I have felt that most players can just go independently and then they can start building on their island as they see fit. That's when the game gets super fun and super exciting. The fact that you can have multiple people building at the same time keeps all of the players engaged. Not only that, it makes the game go so much faster, so much quicker. If you have a group of seasoned players for Earth, you can literally get through an entire game in about 35 minutes, which is absolutely amazing. Maybe 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, but if everybody knows what they're doing, you can get a game done in a record amount of time. And thus, what's exciting is if you have game night, you can play 2 or 3 of these games in the time it would take you to play 1 normal game. So you get multiple iterations of this. It's super fast, super easy to put together, and it keeps players engaged. This is going to be a rules clarification. If you are the active player or a secondary player, it does not matter. You always get to execute these colored actions. So one of the confusing things, I've seen this before, a lot of players feel like, hey, they can only trigger these events if they're the active player. Every single player at the table can trigger these events if they have them active and they're in play. Finally, what I'm going to do in relation to planting, I'm going to give you a little bit of strategy and tactics when you first start playing this game. And I find this to be a big stumbling block for a lot of new players. As an example, we're going to bring all the cards back that we were able to keep in our hand, and we're going to take a quick look at them. Notice that I have 2 pretty pricey ones. I've got a 4 and a 6. I have a 2 and then another 2. What I see a lot of players stumble with is they don't really look at the initial amount of soil that it takes to put cards into play. So as these planting actions are going around the table, they actually don't have enough soil for certain cards, and thus they put nothing into play onto their island. If you get a slow start in Earth, it severely impacts your ability to gain victory points over the course of the game. So what I'm going to recommend is that when you start the game, look for at least 1 or 2 cards in your opening hand that you can put out early. And the reason that you're going to be doing that, let's say I put this moss into play. Notice that it has a triggered event here on the card. So if you don't have any cards in play, you're going to be missing out on all the triggered activities, let's say, that are happening over here. Or let's say you don't have an orange card in play. Anytime this triggered event goes into play and somebody selects this as the active player, you're missing out on whatever this is, the resources or the benefits or the bonuses or whatever it is you're actually getting. So what I advocate is try to get a couple sort of cheap cards into play with triggered events, and that's going to start giving you a bunch of different benefits and resources early on in the game, and that's just going to keep compounding. One of the issues I see is sometimes people really prefer, they're like, hey, I'm going to wait till I get this 6 soil. That's great because you get 7 victory points, but you're missing out on all the resources along the way. And so a lot of your first turns are going to be wasted, and you're not going to be gaining the resources you need to be successful long term. Next up, we're going to talk about rainbow cards, as I call them. I'm going to take this, and we're going to look at this border at the bottom. Notice that it has all 3 of the colors for the triggered events that are on the top of the board, with the exception of the green planting action. What that means is that anytime that the orange, the teal, or this yellow color are selected, you can actually trigger this event. These cards are extremely versatile, and you should pay attention to these when you're drawing cards. Even just having a couple of these multicolored cards can give you a lot of different resource bonuses over the course of the game because it's triggering all the time. So over and over and over again, this can be triggering, and that's a massive amount of stuff that you can get by just putting a couple of these into play early on in the game. Next, we're going to talk about the orange actions at the top of the player board. If this is selected, the active player is going to simply gain 5 of these soil tokens. These are the tokens that are going to be used to place and play new cards into your play area. And then the next icon, I'm going to try to zoom in on that. Hopefully it does it. This is a 2, and it shows sort of 2 cards surrounded by these arrows. This means that you're going to compost from the draw deck. So what does that mean exactly? I'm going to go ahead and just grab this deck right here. We're going to imagine that this is one of the draw decks in the game. And simply when I hit this action, I'm going to take 1, 2 cards off this composting pile, and then they go face down in my compost pile on my playboard. Basically what I'm doing is giving myself 2 victory points, and I'm taking cards from the draw deck and putting them into my composting pile. As I said before, some of these cards that are used in your composting pile, they're going to give you victory points at the end of the game. Alternatively, you can spend these with some of the actions to gain additional effects. And so I'll walk you through kind of what that looks like. Kind of as we mentioned before, when you do have this orange action, what you can do is then trigger all of these orange abilities. And what we just talked about a little bit was the composting pile itself. So there are some interesting things that you can do with that. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this card as an example, and we're going to look at the bottom of this. And notice it says -1 card from your compost, and then it has a colon. That's going to net you 2 cards to draw. So this is how we can spend some of those composting cards. So now I'm going to put this down. I'm going to pop over to my composting pile. If I want to execute this orange action, I just simply take a card from my compost pile, and I'm going to remove it. It goes to the discard pile in the game, and then that way it's going to trigger a draw action, and then I just go back to one of the draw decks, and I just go ahead and pull 2 cards off that, and those cards go into my hand. So that's one way that you can start spending some of these resources. like the composting pile, it doesn't just have to be a repository for victory points at the end of the game. You actually can spend these over the course of the game to get enhanced abilities. Now let's have a quick conversation about what to do if you're not the active player. Let's say we are not the active player. I'll take this token off the map, and thus we have our leaf token at the bottom. If I am not the active player, I can draw 2 soil, or I can compost 2 cards from the draw deck into my compost pile, which is the identical action that we have above if we are that person instead. Now, if we look at the orange sort of iconography here, now we can trigger all of our orange actions, and this can be on anybody's turn, or we can trigger these multicolor actions, which do contain those orange actions as well. So what is kind of common about some of the orange actions? I'm going to go ahead and just zoom over, and we're going to have a quick look at some of the actions that can be performed when these orange cards trigger. So here's an example. For this one right here, I can spend a soil to draw 2 cards. Next up, and we talked about this previously, I can get rid of 1 card from my compost pile to draw 2 cards. Next up, I can get rid of 2 of the sprout tokens. So just as a reminder, these are the sprout tokens. We'll go into how these work in just a little bit. So I can get rid of 2 sprout tokens to gain some soil. On this card, I can simply compost 3 cards from my hand. Now, what exactly does that mean? Let's say over the course of the game, you're drawing a bunch of cards. So as an example, maybe this is our hand. And obviously, we have a ton of cards in our hand, and not all of these are going to be useful. We can use this action right here to remove 3 of these cards from my hand, and I get to choose which ones those are. And then those are going to go face down into my compost pile. So 1, 2, 3. And that will net me 3 victory points at the end of the game. And also, too, I'm also building up a resource that I can use to spend on some of my other orange actions. Next up, we're going to be talking about the watering phase, which is this color located at the top of your player board. If you are the active player, you're going to gain what's called 6 sprouts. So sprouts are going to be these green cubes that are present in the game, and I'll walk you through in a second kind of what that means. Next up, you're going to gain 2 soil, and we already have a pretty good understanding of how soil tokens work, and that's if you're the active player. And then of course here we have that any player can trigger these colored abilities, and then finally if you're the secondary player, rather the non-active player, you can either gain 2 of the sprout tokens or 2 of the soil tokens. So next up, I'm going to show you how sprouts work in the game. So I have 2 cards displayed on the screen to illustrate how the sprouting mechanic works. It's actually pretty simple. Let's say you are the active player and you drew these 6 sprout cubes. What you can do is place these sprout cubes onto any card that has an open sprout position on the card. As an example, I'm going to try to zoom in, and right where my thumbs are, you notice that there are 4 open positions for sprouts. So the sprouts are going to be placed directly onto these cards, and you can put them down in any way that you see fit. As an example, maybe on my sprout action, I'm going to go ahead and put 2 of the tokens on this card, and then on the card over here, I'm going to place the other 4. Please note that each one of these sprout tokens at the end of the game is going to be worth 1 victory point. Now, probably the biggest confusion that I see is when cards, let's say, get completely covered with sprout tokens. So as an example, I'm going to go ahead and cover up every single active position on these 2 cards. If you get any additional sprouts, so let's say you get 2 sprouts from one of the other actions in the game, I can't actually bank these sprouts off to the side. They have to go directly onto cards that I have in my tableau. So if I can't spend these readily, they're just simply lost. I can't bank and save those up. A lot of times when we're playing the game with new players, they just take a huge pile of these and they try to put them by the side of their board, and they think at a later time they can go ahead and put those out. So put them out as they come out, and you can't bank them. Next, I want to bring your attention to sort of the bottom portion where you keep your soil tokens. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so we can take a look at some of the icons that are located here at the bottom of the board. Notice that you can spend 3 of your sprouts and then convert those into 2 soil tokens. And you can do this pretty much anytime with some limitations imposed upon you. As an example, you cannot convert your sprout tokens, so you couldn't take 3 of your sprout tokens while you are gaining them here. So kind of what the point of that is that, let's say, and we talked about this before, your cards are overloaded with sprouts, and let's say you get 2 sprouts as one of the secondary actions, you're a secondary player. On that, you can't actually use them, nor could you spend any of your plant tokens on your cards instantaneously to free up space for the sprouts to get the soil. That's just one of the limitations that's present in the rule book. Now, something else that we're going to be talking about is kind of interrupting other actions. So I'm going to go ahead and just pop out, and we're going to assume that we're executing some of these actions. So as an example, if I'm in the middle of executing this action, which allows me to gain 2 growth cubes, I can't at the same time cash these in for soil while any sort of action is being triggered. And that probably prevents some confusion. I would guess that there's some sort of mechanic that gets a little bit broken if you can trigger this action during the course of one of those other actions going off on the card. So just remember that this is present here. If you start running low on soil, you can use this to help keep generating soil and keep building. As with the other colors that we've talked about previously, you can trigger these secondary events on any player's turn. I'm going to go ahead and just show you some examples of some of these bluish border cards. Here's an example of one. We can get rid of 2 soil to gain 4 sprouts. This one is that we can get rid of some of our trunks, and I'm going to go through trunks in the next section of clips to talk about that to gain some of these sprout tokens. For this card, we can simply gain 2 sprout tokens when it triggers. And then this one right here is going to key off of our compost pile that we talked about before, so we can spend a card from our compost pile, and then we can get 3 trunks. So hopefully what you're seeing so far with a lot of these secondary abilities is that a lot of these game mechanics are interrelated, and so thus over the course of the game you can build some really interesting strategies and combos, because all of these different colored cards are going to be triggering on different people's turns, and it allows you to shift resources, whether it's sprouts, whether it's the trunks, whether it's your soil tokens, whether it's cards in your compost pile, even cards in your hand. So there's all this interplay between these different resources, and that's what makes this game a lot of fun, is because all this stuff is triggering, and as your island starts growing and you put more and more cards into play, the number of options increases significantly. So one thing I do want to make a note on is that when you are triggering special effects, and I don't think I've talked about this previously, they're going to go in the same order that you would read a book. So what does that mean? It means top to bottom, left to right. So if you're going to start executing a bunch of these actions, you're going to start in the top left-hand corner. You're going to progress across each row to the right. So this one would be the first one that triggers, then the second one. Then we go to the next row, this triggers, and then finally this. You have to do it in that order. And that's part of putting your island together and spacing your cards and planning out your maximum of 16 cards. That's part of the fun of it, and that's also part of the challenge. So just understand that if you do skip one of these actions, you can't go back and do it later. So this one triggers, this one triggers, this one triggers, and this one triggers. If you don't want to trigger the event, you don't actually have to do that, but they have to trigger in that order. One clarification I just want to note is that your cards, such as your island and your climate, can also have these colored borders at the bottom, and these will also trigger when you're doing your tableau on the left-hand side of your player board. Now you can choose if you want to do your island cards first, or you can do these cards first. It doesn't matter. But just remember that some of the cards over here will trigger, and I see a lot of new players forget these 2 cards specifically, and they don't actually trigger a lot of those abilities over the course of the game, so I keep reminding them to do it. They do so, but then when they kind of get out on their own, they easily forget. So if you're a new player, just keep in mind that you could have some of these triggered effects also in the middle of your player board. Next, we're going to move on to this growing phase, which is located on the right-hand side of the player board. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that we need to kind of go through some of the terminology. This is pretty easy, though. So this first icon just simply means draw 4 cards. But this right here means that we're going to be adding 2 different things. And this is going to be trunks and canopies. I alluded to this at the beginning of the video, and I'm going to go ahead and just pop back over so we can have a quick conversation about this. We have these sort of tan wooden cubes. These are going to be our trunks. And then the canopies are going to be these 4 different colored caps that go onto the trunks themselves. There is no difference between any of the colors on these. And when you're assembling these, you just simply put them face up, and then you start stacking. And then finally, when you place a canopy, you just simply put it on top. So it looks like a mushroom growing in your forest. So how do these cards ultimately work? I'll go ahead and walk you through a quick example of this, and I walked you through it on the scoring, but I'll do it again just for a quick reminder. Located on a lot of your Flora cards, not necessarily all of them, are these symbols kind of placed in the upper right-hand corner of the picture. And notice that there's a 2 number on the screen that's brown. That is indicating the maximum height of essentially the growth that we can put onto this card. So what does that mean? In this case, if it's a 2, what that means is I can be 2 tall. And so thus the first token I put down is going to be 1 height. The second token is going to be the canopy. So this is going to be 2 tall essentially. And then we're just going to place it on the card in the upper right hand corner. And basically what this means is that this growth is completely done. It can't actually get any taller because it has been capped. What makes this easy to see is that if you just look over and you see a colored cap, you know that you can have no more growth actually occur on that card. So very similar to Sprouts, if you can't place the growth, thus you can't place any trunks or canopies onto your cards, those are just simply lost. You can't bank them off to the side. This is very similar to what happened with the Sprouts. Secondarily, let's have a quick conversation about scoring, just as a quick reminder. At the end of the game, if I have just this 1 trunk on the card, this is going to be 1 victory point. But if I have a canopy on this, it's going to score me the number that is in this icon. So thus this would score me 4 victory points instead of 2. So conceptually, it's to my advantage to consistently cap off these cards and get the bonuses from them. And what you're going to see over the course of the game is that some of these cards have a massive amount of victory points associated with you adding the canopy. So be very mindful of that when you are playing the game. So we're going to pop back to the player card right here, and I'm going to point to this icon. We just talked about trunks and canopies. So as an example, if this icon triggers, and notice that it can be both for the active player and then other players as well, you can take just simply 2 of these trunk tokens and place them onto your cards. Just remember though, if you hit the top, like we did in the last example, that's going to add a canopy. So in this example, we added a trunk and a canopy, so those are going to be the 2 pieces that we add onto the Flora card that we just talked about. Now, what else we're seeing right here is that we can trigger sort of these tan colored abilities as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pop over to sort of our fake island area, and we're going to just look at 4 cards I drew kind of at random from the draw deck to see what sort of abilities can trigger. So this one is interesting. It says +1 trunk on each of these types of plants. So it's going to be this icon right here in this column. And notice too, it has arrows for the column, so this is going to be up and down. I noticed while we were teaching this game, especially to some younger players, they got confused on the difference between rows and columns. So just note too that point out to newer players that the arrows do matter on the cards. I don't know if you can see those. I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see that. So in this case, things that are positioned in the column can give you additional trunks, essentially. So that's kind of an interesting mechanic. This is a mechanic that we've seen before. It just simply says draw 2 cards. Next up it says, hey, we're going to add 3 growth on any of the 8 adjacent flora. So if this thing is kind of sitting in the middle of your island, when this thing triggers, you can take 3 growth maximum and place it on cards that are sitting around this one. That's pretty cool. That's a neat mechanic, I think. And then next up, we have another composting action that we've seen kind of before. We're going to discard a card from our compost pile, and we're going to gain 3 of those sprout tokens, and we already talked about sprouts. So as you can see, the theme continues. The interrelated number of icons that you can see on here is pretty exciting, and that's what keeps the game fresh. As you start building your island, you start getting all these cool secondary effects. Next up, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the objectives and when to actually check to see if those conditions are met. At the end of any turn, after all players have completed all of their actions, this is a great time to check to see if any of these objective conditions have been met. So starting with the active player, remember that this is going to be the active player token. That player is going to check first, and then it's going to rotate around the table. If the active player has met any of the conditions, that player gets to take one of their leaf tokens and place it on the objective that they have met. And then it goes to the next player in a clockwise position from the active player, and then maybe they have also met a victory condition. So it's possible over the course of one game turn that 2 players meet the same conditions, and thus the one who is the active player gets the first opportunity to place their marker on the board, and then it goes around the table. So if you notice, there is sort of a competitive portion of the game where you are trying to meet these objectives as quick as possible, and then you're thus going to score some more points. I have seen games where it is possible that multiple players, and I've seen it on several occasions, where 4 players meet the same objective on the same turn, and thus you can see that they all get into the mix and score these points. Just remember, it's going to key off of who the active player is. The game does come with a notepad, and I have it in the center of the screen to help you tabulate all the scores at the end. Notice that it looks fairly complex and complicated. It's actually not that bad. What I do recommend doing is simply going into the rule book, and there is a section toward the end of the rule book on page 14 that really walks you through how to do this in a stepwise progression. So literally just start from number 1 and work your way all the way through using this score notepad. You can use that, or a piece of scratch paper, or you can use the calculator on your phone, whatever. Once you have all of this stuff tabulated, whoever has the highest number of victory points wins the game. My final thoughts for Earth are very, very positive. I'm going to walk you through what I like about the game. First, it is extremely easy to set up. You can set up the game in about 5, maybe even 10 minutes. The most difficult process is just simply shuffling the massive amount of cards that are present in the game. There's a pretty hefty pile. Let's go ahead and throw that into the middle of the camera. That's really the most difficult part of the game setup, is just shuffling that huge deck of cards. But that being said, the reason that the game is so much fun is in part that there are so many cards. So think about all the different possibilities that can occur when you're playing this game, and every single experience you have with this game is totally unique. It's totally different. Thus, all these cards are different. Then your island card is going to be different every time. Your climate card is going to be different every time. Your ecosystem card is going to be different every time. Your objectives, so for your fauna, and then the 2 alternative ecosystems on this board as well, are going to be different. So that adds a lot of replay ability to the game. Next, I think it's a pretty easy game to learn. After about the 3rd or 4th turn in a game, most players are fairly comfortable at playing the game, especially when they have completed their first game. They can be kind of autonomous. So what makes this game also really effective is that it's very engaging. On every single turn, every player can be doing something, whether you're the active player or if you're one of the other players at the table. You're playing all at the same time, and that makes the game a lot of fun. I do want to caution you, if you do bring new players to the table, make sure that they're doing all of the game mechanics correctly and that they understand everything. And if they don't understand, just be open with them and be like, hey, if you ever get confused with any of the icons, go ahead and just ask questions. Something else I want to bring into light, and I haven't mentioned this before, at the bottom of the game board is a reference guide, and it kind of teaches you what a lot of the different symbols mean. So if you ever forget while you're playing, this is a great resource to go to. The other thing that makes this game so much fun is the interplay and resources. So we've talked about all the different things that we have. We have these soil tokens, we have the sprouts, we have the trunks and the canopies that are all located in here. We have all of that interplay between everything that's happening. It makes it really exciting. When you're playing with the fauna cards, what's exciting about this is you're competing to get these objectives first. So there's a little bit of a competition going on with that. So all in all, this is a very, very strong game. Over the course of researching this game and over the course of setting up this video, our game group taught this to 11 people total, and the overall feedback was very, very positive. Every single player said that they liked this game and that they enjoyed it. And I'll even take that a step further. About half the players, after we finished the first game, asked to play it again immediately. And that's a really good sign if you play a lot of board games. When a new player to something is so excited about the game that they ask to play it again immediately after you finish the first game. And what makes this game so effective too is once you learn it, you can finish a game in like 35 to 45 minutes once everybody knows what they're doing. So you can put this game on the table multiple times in one gaming session. So as always, I want to thank you for joining me today. And as always, have fun gaming.